Microphone. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, what a great morning to be outside. But it's really nice in here, too, to have the sun coming in and have such a large crowd assembled to learn some remarkable things. I'm sure we're going to all be very thankful we came to this event. So I'm Jonathan Overpeck, the Dean of Seas. Everyone calls me Dean Peck. And I hope you've been enjoying Climate Week. I guess we're technically almost halfway through. Just an amazing number of events, and make sure you check out the events that have yet to occur, and you avail yourselves of this great opportunity. There are many really great things at the University of Michigan, but these kinds of events are really second to none in any university I've been at. And, yesterday, hearing from the former Secretary of Energy, former Governor of Michigan, Jennifer Granholm, was an amazing event. And I hope some of you went to that. There were some empty seats, but it was really instilled a lot of hope and optimism. And that's another thing that I think we all need to keep an eye on. There are a lot of dark things happening in the world, particularly with respect to environment and sustainability, and it's important for us to realize that we can do things about it. And there's certainly a lot of reason for hope on just about every topic, but the hope will only be materialized if we all work hard together to make it happen. All right, so that's totally going off script here. Before I introduce today's keynote speaker, Dr. Diana Hernandez, I wanted to thank our sponsoring organization, which is the Office of Vice Provost for Sustainability and Climate Action. We have the Vice Provost in attendance. I want to thank you for everything. Shalonda Baker. If anyone's getting worn out, it's you and your team. But you're doing wonderfully. So far, so good. I also want to thank all the students. It's funny, in my script it says they're flowers, and there are no flowers. Where are they? Oh, cool. Cool. Well, I want to thank the students who grew those flowers and put them there. Who did that? Anyone in the room? Yeah? Okay, well, it's good. Those are worked with Joe Trumpy, who runs our, yay, Joe. Is Joe here? He's not here. Yay. Great job, anyhow, with flowers. And I want to take a moment to read our land acknowledgement. That's something that's important to all of us. The University of Michigan is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Ojibwe, Ottawa, Potawatomi nations made the largest single land transfer to the University of Michigan. Through these words of acknowledgement, their contemporary and ancestral ties to the land and their contributions to the university are renewed and reaffirmed. A commitment to building a more sustainable, equitable future is at the center of the work we do in SEAS, and we understand that this can only be accomplished by building authentic relationships and partnerships with Indigenous peoples. A few examples of how we do this include a recently signed memorandum of understanding with the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians to collaborate on their new research center, the Consortium for Cooperative Ecological Research in northern Michigan. SEAS houses the Global Center for Climate Change and Transboundary Waters, which is a partnership involving 6 research teams from the Red Lake Nation, the Menominee Nation, 6 nations of the Grand River in Canada, and the United States. And beyond North America, SEAS has significant collaborations with Indigenous peoples in many countries, including Nepal, Kenya, Indonesia, New Zealand, Cameroon, the Philippines, Bangladesh, Thailand, among others. So, you're in for a big event today, a long event, a very rich event. There are 2 parts. First, we'll hear from our keynote speaker, sociologist Dr. Diana Hernandez, who will discuss her transformative work that examines the social and environmental determinants of health. She has also studied the impacts of policy and place-based interventions on the well-being of socioeconomically disadvantaged populations with a focus on energy insecurity. Then she will be joined by our very own Dr. Tony Reams for a fireside chat all about what it takes to build a more equitable energy system for all. And if you haven't noticed, we're in the middle of probably the biggest energy transformation, probably. We are in the middle of the biggest energy transformation the planet has ever seen. And we have to do it equitably and justly. Here's a bit more information about these two wonderful colleagues and scholars. Dr. Hernandez, she's a tenured associate professor at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health and co-director of the Energy Opportunity Lab at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia. But right now she's up in Boston, where she's a climate justice fellow at Harvard University's Radcliffe and Salata Institutes. A pioneering sociologist, Dr. Hernandez is a leading authority on energy insecurity, a concept she defined and advanced through groundbreaking research. Some of you have her book that she's brought with her. Her work, rooted in a community engagement and policy innovation, addresses systemic barriers to housing and energy access and affordability, and pilots interventions with national impact. The book I mentioned just a second ago, Powerless, The People's Struggle for Energy, was published in 2025, and it's the first major book on energy insecurity in the US. There's energy insecurity all over the world, but there's energy insecurity in the US. And that's something you really want to take home and take to heart. You know, these problems are ones felt by disadvantaged communities in the poorest countries of the world and in the richest countries in the world. We've got to do better. Dr. Hernandez has published over 100 peer-reviewed works, secured $10 million in research funding, delivered, this is amazing, 300 invited talks. That's a lot. And advised policymakers nationwide. A South Bronx native, she earned her BA from Hunter College and a PhD in sociology from Cornell University. Dr. Reams, our other renowned speaker today, is the Tishman Professor of Environmental Justice and Associate Professor at SEAS. He is widely recognized for his scholarship and senior government leadership in environment and energy justice. He founded the Urban Energy Justice Lab and the Energy Equity Project, and currently serves as director of the UMC's Detroit Sustainability Clinic, which is fantastic. His research centers on advancing fair and equitable access to affordable, reliable, and clean energy, and on examining the root causes and persistence of energy disparities across race, income, and geography. Tony's tireless. From 2021 to 23, he was a presidential as in the President of the United States, appointee in the Biden-Harris administration, serving in several roles, senior roles in the U.S. Department of Energy. He began as senior advisor in the Office of Economic Impact and Diversity and as deputy director for energy justice. He established and led the first ever Office of Energy Justice Policy and Analysis, overseeing research and evaluation of federal energy policies and programs to advance racial and socioeconomic equity. Later, as principal deputy director for the Office of State and Community Energy Programs, he partnered with the state and local entities to accelerate place-based clean energy solutions in collaboration with government, community, business, and other stakeholders. And he's done a lot for the whole nation, including Michigan. And we thank you for that. Yeah. Dr. Reams holds a PhD in public administration from the University of Kansas, a Master of Engineering Management from Kansas State University, and a BS in Civil Engineering from North Carolina Agriculture and Technological State University. He's also a licensed professional engineer. Where do you get time for all this? And with experience across public and private sectors. Prior to his academic and government service, he served as commissioned officer in the U.S. Army, achieving the rank of captain and completing a tour of duty in Iraq. So with that, I would like to invite Dr. Hernandez to join me up here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dean Overpeck, for that really wonderful introduction. I really refuse to be water insecure, so I'm sorry that I'm just gonna put up here. Is that all right? Totally fine. Okay, can you hear me? Can you all hear me? Good morning. It's Climate Week, y'all. Woohoo! Inaugural Climate Week at University of Michigan. What an honor to be here. Thank you for waking up early. For those of you that are in class, I hope you learn a lot. I really want to start off in recognition and gratitude. Sometimes friends and our colleagues and people in the walk and in the field, and I'm just so grateful to Vice Provost Shalonda Baker, so proud of what you're doing, what you've accomplished, your leadership, and to my dear friend Tony Reams. We've been at this for a very long time. I still remember you might have been in your office here at Michigan as a postdoc when we Skyped. So not Zoomed, but Skyped. I want to acknowledge, right, my co-author, Jennifer Laird, who's on faculty and in the CUNY system at Lehman, and of course my team, because in many ways I'm here because of their efforts as well. Let's get right into it. The climate is warming and climate change is real and it's happening, and 2024 was the hottest year on record, and that record keeps changing every year. We're making we're breaking the previous year's record. This is a graphic from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, that is really kind of showing the global impact of climate change. And these are the same data, but I'm an experiential person. And I had the privilege of going up to the Arctic last summer. And there was something incredibly important about that experience, because it was to see the magic of ice, to actually understand the longevity of some of the icebergs and the beauty of the colors, and it was like basically being in Frozen, but like in real life, the movie Frozen. But at the same time, to see the glaciers receding literally before our eyes was like painful. And when we think about climate change, oftentimes we're thinking about the polar bears and the ice and the seals and the penguins, and these are actually real pictures from that trip. And I want to acknowledge that there's something really important about thinking about the environment in those terms. And I'm a mom, and I have a 4-year-old, and this is her in the Bronx. This is her first winter, actually, snow. She was almost 3 years old at that point. And you can tell, that's really wax snow, right? It's barely there, and she's sliding down in a plastic garbage can lid, because she's a Bronx girl, right? And there's a way in which, as a mom, I definitely think about how the climate is changing her realities, and her future will look different. But we're also situated in the Bronx, and in many ways, what I know to be true is that there are ways in which the circumstances of that context mean that people are actually suffering, not in some future state, but oftentimes like right now. And the way that I have always been able to articulate and feel and connect has actually been at this kind of intersection of energy and housing and poverty and health. And there are times when all of those things really come together. And this is an example of a January story in New York City, which is not that uncommon. This is a story from 2022 about a deadly fire. And the headlines and the news coverage around this was that there was a faulty kind of fire safety and suppression system, that basically the staircases had become chimneys, that the self-closing door didn't actually function properly. But that would actually only be looking at the issues around the fire, but not the cause of the fire. The cause of the fire was actually a space heater that was on incessantly for days on end, and cost 17 lives, 8 of which were children. And so as someone who's been dispatching from this community, I often write in the local newspapers, and in this case I wrote, "The misery and fatal impact of inadequate heat and poor housing conditions that Bronxites face must be recognized for what it is: a predictable harm and a preventable wrong. Beyond greater fire safety messages, the takeaway from this latest calamity is that Bronx residents deserve to experience energy security, thermal comfort, and dignity at home." And I wish that was an isolated incident, but the truth is that this just happened earlier this year. And if we can kind of anticipate what moves forward, right? If we think about this as a preventable harm and a predictable one, then we might be able to see that at the root of this are stories of people having inadequate heat in their homes. It's 2025, and I want to acknowledge that this is a year that marks important milestones when we think about climate impacts and its disparate connections to communities from an environmental justice perspective, from a climate justice perspective. The Chicago heat wave of 1995, which happened 30 years ago, really showed us that we have the potential for excess deaths, in this case, 739 lives, to occur. And the explanation for that could be social resilience, but oftentimes it's a lack of adequate infrastructure, cooling infrastructure in people's homes. Hurricane Katrina, this is the 20-year mark of Hurricane Katrina. Likewise, a very challenging experience where there was a lot of preventable harm that occurred, and the face of that were Black and brown folks in a city that has not recovered in a way that has been equitable. So I just want to remind us that we're making all sorts of connections to climate, but that oftentimes these climate justice impacts are so real. I'm Nuyorican, and that's an important identity. That's like part of the Puerto Rican diaspora that landed in New York and now is global. But when I think about climate change and the disparate impacts of major weather events, in this case, Hurricanes Irma and Maria that happened in 2017 in September, so again, marking an important anniversary there. The longevity of this experience of Hurricane Maria basically meant that this person, Manuel, a retired police officer that I met in Humacao, Puerto Rico, which was at the eye of the storm, basically lived without power for almost 6 months. And it was the disruption of his everyday experience in trying to manage getting food on the table, and being able to provide for his family the safety and security that he so prioritized as a former law enforcement person. and just the challenges of imagining what it would be to actually adopt solar that I think about when I think, again, about not just these major weather events, but what are the strategies that we create for true resilience in our communities. And so I just want to acknowledge that these are real circumstances, and that one important goal of this work is actually to bridge climate justice and bring it home. At the kitchen table, where our families are, people are wondering, how are they going to keep housing, a roof over their head, food on the table, and the lights on? And yet, sometimes the conversations around climate are happening at such a high level. Climate Week in New York City is a really good example of people that are circulating good ideas, but very seldom are they actually bringing in the kind of local communities and asking them, what matters to you? How do we actually create solutions that matter for you and to you? And the truth is that I see energy as that connective tissue. I see energy as the opportunity to both be in conversation, but also bring real solutions that support people in terms of their social resilience, but also climate resilience and environmental justice. According to the International Energy Agency, energy and climate are inextricably linked. The global energy system is the bedrock of modern economies and societies, but the production and consumption of energy is responsible for 75% of greenhouse gas emissions, making it, according to the IEA, the primary driver of climate change. At home, this basically translates into all of the different ways that we are relying on energy to facilitate our lives, from heating and cooling to refrigeration and lighting and cooking. This is the software that powers our lives. It may operate invisibly in the background, but it is so critical in terms of how we actually live and exist, especially in the built environment. But there are many people around the US, that is my focus, but also globally, as Dean Peck mentioned, that are having trouble adequately meeting their household energy needs. And you may think about energy security from a national security perspective, but at a household level, energy insecurity is about not having lacking the ability to afford a utility bill, for instance. So there's an economic component to energy insecurity. There's also a physical component to energy insecurity, which has to do with how your housing system is built and operates, how efficient it is, what are the deficiencies that exist there, and then the coping strategies. People are actively coping around energy, and to strip them of the agency and the recognition of all of the effort that people are putting in to make do under really difficult circumstances. That space heater is a coping strategy that someone was using in order to produce heat in a home that was otherwise unheated. And this is a topic that I've dedicated the better part of a decade and a half to, really understanding, unpacking, operationalizing, and understanding both the prevalence and impact of energy insecurity around the United States. I had done a study, and that's why I was shouting out Dorchester and the city of Boston, in Dorchester, where this was really an incidental finding. It was the kind of thing where you go in for an MRI and then you realize, oh, there's something else, and that something else needs a follow-up. So my dissertation research was on something that was it was related to housing and health, but there was this energy piece that was emergent and was so interesting, and I felt it was necessary to kind of document, but also to say, like, is this only happening in cold weather places, or is this actually something that impacts Americans around the country? And so this book is really about telling the story of energy insecurity in the United States. It's a mixed method study that involved 100 interviews that I conducted personally in 10 different places around the United States, and also involves two surveys, one that is original, and then the other that is based on the Residential Energy Consumption Survey. And it lands on an action framework. I'm gonna walk through all of that. So these are the places that I visited for this study: California, Arizona, Montana, Tennessee, Alabama, Puerto Rico, Pennsylvania, New York, and of course here actually in Detroit. And I wanna just start recognizing that I always think that the local piece is very important. So I wanna start with a local story. It was Tony actually that linked me up with the folks at Wayne Metro Community Action Agency. And here I met a woman, Edith, who lived in Detroit. She had driven to the Community Action Agency on a cold January morning. And it was, in some ways, her car was the place where she would get warm. She was living in this home. This is an actual picture of the home. I got it off of Zillow. And, you know, when I met her, she said, I just don't have heat in my house. My pipes have frozen. In the mornings, my routine is, as kind of demonstrated here, I won't read the whole quote, but she's like, I go in to the deep freeze of my bathroom, and I try to like clean myself up. She was using a 5-gallon water, like the filtered water. She was using that because she didn't have running water because her pipes had frozen. And she just talked about like kind of this, she couldn't cook. The DTE had cut off her gas services due to a leak. And she went to the Community Action Agency basically with a shut-off notice for her electricity. But of course, that was just one indication of a hardship, because what was actually really happening, well, let me just say that she watched the news. She had recently watched the news, and she saw this story that was on the local news cast, and it was basically, you know, a woman in a very similar position. And she said, I thought I was the only one. I thought I was the only one dealing with this, but then I saw this story, and I realized, you know what, I am not the only person. You know, long story short, she was able to get energy assistance that day to keep her electricity on. But when I was writing up the book, I had done, for some of the feature stories, additional research, and I saw her address, her home, her family home where she'd grown up, and you know, it was like kind of the anchor of their family life. She had actually returned back to that family home to care for her ailing dad, and at some point he actually died in the home. But she was basically living in a dying home at that point. And on the Zillow ad that had listed the home for $30,000, it said, this house has huge profit potential. The home is in need of a total rehab, absolutely gorgeous, with all of the size and characteristics you want in a rehab. And eventually it did sell for less than that. But at the core of what she really needed was a new boiler. She needed that rehab. She understood that the house had good bones, but when it was very difficult for her to actually get the energy assistance, the comprehensive energy assistance that she needed that would have actually unlocked the potentials of this home. So basically, that's just one story. That's Edith's story. From these qualitative stories and interviews, I was able to basically describe the essential elements of energy insecurity. So kind of driving in and going deeper into the economic dimension. So difficulty paying, utility debt, disconnection, the physical dimensions, inefficiencies, deficiencies, and outages, the coping dimension. So difficult choices, those difficult trade-offs, discomfort, deprivation that people, you might be actually, there are energy burden metrics that look at the percentage of household income that's allocated toward utility bills, but that doesn't actually get at the underconsumption of energy. So energy limiting behavior, as Destiny Knock would call it, right? This idea that people are actually under-consuming energy and that doesn't get reflected, but it is a coping strategy. And just like we have a way of describing the ways in which people are, there's so much disruption now. Just the way that we have a way of describing food insecurity, right, as hunger, and then in its kind of most grave state as malnutrition. It was actually from the interviews that the felt experience of energy insecurity as drain surfaced, and that if you are draining something enough, that there's actually a degree of depletion that occurs. And so this was all some of the kind of main findings. Where this book kind of lands, among other things, is in understanding that this is a process, that this is not necessarily about individual characteristics, although when we look at the statistics, and I'll share those soon, you see that there are kind of patterned inequalities, and you might misattribute this to these kind of personal characteristics of individuals, but this is really sitting within these kind of systemic, structural, there's a structural explanation for this that really sits in the social, political, environmental, and economic structures. And then that there are these exogenous kind of shocks and triggers that occur, and that there's this kind of dynamic that happens in this process. And it leads to adverse health and social consequences. In Edith's case, the displacement of, like she was no longer living in that house. So how do we measure this, right? How do we take Edith's story and a whole process and these essential elements to kind of understand how common this experience is in the US? So we looked at the residential energy consumption survey and my original survey, the Energy Equity, Housing, and Health Survey, and estimated that about 1 in 10 US households experience energy insecurity, and that is measured as a cumulative burden. So with an underlying kind of premise on experiencing a financial hardship, how many households are also experiencing the physical hardships that are indicated here in blue? So lacking an air conditioning unit, insulation, inadequate insulation, drafts, coping by reducing or foregoing basic necessities, keeping homes at an unhealthy temperature, or seeking energy assistance, and then also including power outages. And that's really important because that is one of those areas where we don't necessarily often think about power outages as an economic issue, because they don't, power outages don't tend to discriminate, right? But the impacts, there are disparate impacts that flow from power outages. And so we wanted to be able to track all of this. And by this measure, 40% of the US population is at risk, even though they're not actively experiencing a financial hardship. But they are at risk, and so they might lose a job, like, have a layoff, or have kind of a big expense that throws off their household budgets, and then therefore they would be impacted. We're talking about millions of households. So this is the percentage, this is the rate, but then when you look at the actual absolute numbers, this is millions of households in the United States are experiencing energy insecurity, and it's not all even. So that households of color, Black and Hispanic and mixed race and other race households are more likely to experience energy insecurity than their white counterparts. The lowest income groups are most likely people with less than college education, households with children, people living in mobile homes, in older homes, and in places other than the Midwest, but also in rural areas, are all more likely to experience energy insecurity. But when I think about what this means, I think about the story of Betty, who I met in Alabama. And Betty, when I met her, she was so proud to live in a home that she built from the ground up with her husband. They had been there for 45 years. And she managed her energy use so closely. She turned everything off, the water heater. There was not a clock or some other kind of electronic appliance or whatever that didn't need to be plugged in. It was all really carefully managed. And she said, you know what? It's not that I don't know what I'm doing. I'm very particular about everything, and I still can't keep up. And this is the letter that she was looking to write to the utility company. And it was, this is an actual picture of the letter. And, she just had some trouble, like, fully articulating and writing it out. And part of what she asked me to do following up on that interview was to help her to, finish the letter and write it to the utility company. And I did that proudly. But when I think about what this book is, it's the extended version of that letter to really explain and articulate what it feels like to do everything that you can, all of the work that's involved, and still feel like you can't keep up. And her notion of this was not unfounded. When you look at the rising utility bills in the United States, you really do see this upward trend. And it's not to do with consumption, that's the green line. It has to do with prices. And she happened to be in Alabama, where they have some of the highest utility bills in the country. So again, those structural explanations are really critical for understanding the people's lived experiences. This is a chart about electricity prices and how they're going up, but also how the profits, the revenue streams are also increasing. And the driver of that is residential rates. It isn't commercial rates. That's in the yellow line. That's pretty flat. And it isn't commercial rates. It's actually the people that are paying much higher utility bills based on these rates. And the truth is that when energy intersects with poverty and inequality, people are basically suffering. This is a woman that I met in the Bronx. She also had this really strong attachment to her home. She said, if I had to leave my home, I would die the second day. This idea of being rooted in home, and that's where it becomes emotional. Like, these experiences are not just about, some abstract thing. It literally is a felt experience. And she basically talked about the fear of social isolation. She said, I really manage my thermostat and I put it just enough. But she said, if I put it too low, my family won't go, right? This idea that her visitors wouldn't come if her home wasn't hospitable. And that's a real concern. And the reasons for that may be a temperature setting on a thermostat, but sometimes it's also about the physical conditions of homes. And what we're seeing and looking at trends in the United States is that the health of our housing stock, of our nation's housing stock, is actually getting worse, not better, right? When we lose the opportunities to weatherize homes and really invest in energy performance through the IRA, for instance, it's a real loss because it means that the buildings and the homes that people are occupying are still inadequately insulated. They're drafty, they're lacking heating and cooling. And this ultimately means that people are experiencing thermal discomfort and they're coping in really extreme ways. So I want to just point you to the black lines. These black lines up top are keeping your home extremely hot or extremely cold. And when people experience, 70% of people that experience both the physical and economic elements or dimensions of energy insecurity are keeping their homes extremely hot or extremely cold. They're also reducing expenses for basic necessities to pay their bills. They're using their stoves or ovens for heat, restricting which rooms they occupy in their homes. They're leaving their homes and they're moving. And it really kind of goes to show you, like, first of all of the work that's involved, but the real, like, significant human toll. I just want to talk about disconnections. I actually had the pleasure of being interviewed by a group here in their work on disconnections, so I just want to give a little shout out there. And say that, look, disconnections impact about 3% of the population. These are disconnections related to non-payment, but I would actually say, and that's really kind of strongly argued in the book, is that it's inhumane about 100% of the time when we're talking about non-payment due to affordability challenges. And the reason why that inhumane piece is so critical is that I met a woman in California, Marissa, and she talked about, I went to her home, she had been without power for 8 days, and she said, over the past week, we've been savaging it, meaning that they were just using their home as a place to sleep. They could not cook, they could not take showers. She had to actually go to other people's homes to actually do all of those things for her and her family. And it was inhumane. And she said, you know what? My next paycheck won't even cover what I owe. I've been paying them what I can pay them, but I just can't ever keep up, right? So this is, again, that kind of the precursor to a disconnection is about not being able to catch up. I want to talk a little bit about federal policy. I won't talk about it too much, but I will say that the origin story of the U.S. energy safety net is actually in the 1970s oil crisis. And in many ways, it hasn't been revisited. So it remains a heating apparatus, a heating support apparatus, a crisis support apparatus, and to a much lesser extent about cooling and weatherization kind of being a more preventive strategy. I was born in 1982. The funding formulas were from 1981, and the new one is 1984. And there's a huge enrollment or eligibility enrollment gap, so that about 17% of eligible households are actually receiving the low-income home energy assistance program, and less than 1%, 0.2% are actually receiving the weatherization assistance program. So huge gaps there, and there's a lot of uncertainty. I mean, right now we have a shutdown. It's really unclear what happens. To some extent, energy affordability is a stated priority for this administration. And so it was not cut like in the last round of funding cuts, but there's a lot of uncertainty. There's definitely this kind of cloud. And there are lots of shortcomings. There's really actually some possibilities in terms of solutions. And I don't necessarily want to go into these particular programs because what we actually need is something much more comprehensive. Bill assistance and weatherization alone are not enough to actually adequately support households that are experiencing energy insecurity in the United States. So this book kind of lands on an action framework that's meant it's kind of targeted at the state and local level with a focus on data. Where there is no data, it is very difficult to manage and monitor what's actually happening. And the data is dated. And it's expensive otherwise to administer these kinds of surveys that are representative and et cetera. So there's definitely a piece of this which is about the screening, the public health surveillance and surveys that are really necessary. Participation in energy decision-making. I want to shout out Justin from the Energy Equity Project for advancing a lot of the work on participation in energy decision-making. Affordable bills. How do we think about affordability? One of the things that I learned through and through is that people actually want to pay their utilities. And they do pay what they can to try to avoid a utility disconnection, but oftentimes it just exceeds their capacities. So how do we think about percent of income payment plans and other opportunities to really kind of level set on the affordability strategies for people to be able to pay and manage their utility bills? We need robust energy and social safety nets. Cutting Medicaid, cutting food-related aid will only worsen the problem of energy insecurity when you think about all of the trade-offs that people are already making. Knowledge, advancing energy literacy. It's amazing how few people know the basics around energy, and we may not necessarily appreciate the educational elements, but they're so critical. Of course, efficiency, electrification, and clean energy access, which we hope is still, moving forward. We had a really hopeful event yesterday with former Secretary Granholm, who really kind of pointed out this is already happening. We really wish so, because that's also about improving the housing stock and reducing consumption overall, and disconnection reform. I think we have to really think about our society and whether or not it is conscionable to continue to disconnect people on the basis of affordability. And the reason why there's this action framework is because I've never been a traditional academic. I've always felt the need not just to validate the experiences of people that are impoverished and struggling, because I grew up in the Bronx and that's my context, but I've also been a practitioner, a housing practitioner, and I know what it is to take a ruined building and transform it into something that is beautiful and has solar and triple pane windows and high R value insulation and all of these things. And there's been something completely instructive about rehabilitating 3 buildings in my community and really being prideful about the idea of keeping roots in a disadvantaged community. And so I want us to think about what it would look like to support Edith. This is the actual picture from Zillow. And then I asked ChatGPT to give me a rendering of a remodeled home. Can we imagine this for the millions of households that are experiencing the economic and physical challenges of energy insecurity? Do we feel like they're deserving? Do we feel like this is possible? What are the barriers of our imagination, of the current policy landscape that we have to kind of unlock, untangle, and do differently in order to get to this? Because I actually know what it is to go from this ruinous place to this, right? I think this is possible, but we have to be ambitious, we have to be bold, we have to be committed. And this is what it would actually look like to relieve people of unnecessary and uneven human and ecological suffering. It would look like comfort. It would look like health. It would look like dignity, connection, community well-being, and security that redefines resilience. And that's what this is about. Thank you so much. Oh, thank you. Where do we sit on time? Are we okay on time? Oh, yeah, okay.
We had class time with people.
Oh, no, that's all right, that's all right. Yeah, oh, I see.
Give folks a few minutes to, yeah. Wow. Where do we start? You all don't know how much of an honor it is to sit here with my friend, my colleague, my mentor, I've known Diana over a decade now. I actually want to give a little inside story. Diana actually connected me to Shalonda Baker, and so she is partially responsible for me ended up at DOE. And so there's a really nice community of folks who are looking at this intersection between energy and justice in a variety of ways. You mentioned your beautiful daughter, Adina, and that you recently became a mother, but some years ago you birthed something else, right? And I often call Diana the mother of energy and security because she really raised this issue to a level of salience that had never been before. And so I know you wear that honor with pride. And she mentioned Skype, which there are probably folks in the room that don't know what Skype is. It was how we did video before Zoom, but as a brand new PhD looking for a community of scholars to do this type of work, she was the only one that I could find here in the US. And so I was so eager to reach out to her and gain wisdom on how to make these very important connections. And so, just to go back a little bit, thinking about the last decade plus of taking an idea, bringing it to fruition in beautiful ways through story, through visualization, through data analysis. I just want you to talk to folks a little bit about the journey, how you accidentally found this topic, but what it took to bring it to where it is today. And I'll ask some follow-up questions about this so folks know just the impact that you've had in this work. But yeah, tell us a little bit about how you feel about energy justice, energy and security, and where the field is over the last decade plus.
Yeah. Well, let me just echo in the kind of admiration for being here, but your work and Shalonda, we actually were out dancing. You had to remind me of the story, right? Exactly. And it just goes to show you that, a big part of how sometimes collaborations and friendships emerge is actually just by bringing your whole self to work. And just being authentic. And I really have kind of prioritized that in my own life and relationships. And I think that that's actually, in many ways, the kind of origin story of this work. So, I'm going to just be real. So I started my PhD when I was very young. I was 19 when I started. And I had been living at home up until that time. And I went to Cornell, and I felt really like just the cultural shock of being in a very different place, rural area. It was cold, it was dark. I actually ended up when I was a graduate student being a recipient of LIHEAP and weatherization because I have fallen behind on my utility bills. But I don't even think it was just because I didn't know to pay bills, So it wasn't really about affordability, but it basically, I became, as someone who benefited from the program, I never thought, fast forward, that it would be so fundamental to my life and career. And then I was about to drop out of school, and my dissertation advisor, one of my committee members, was like, listen, there's this project. I would do it. I can't do it. You should do it. Consider it for your dissertation. And rather than resist, I was like, you know what? I'm going to lean into this. It's an opportunity. And I kind of treated it as just like a clean slate, and I think every student should really think about these opportunities that open up with a certain seriousness and a kind of an openness to what can come of it, because it can literally be transformative. And in my case, I followed the work, and it was about housing and medical legal partnership and how legal services within the context of clinical settings could help mitigate the relationship between poor housing and poor health. And what ended up happening was that I was sitting in people's homes in Dorchester, which was not unlike the Bronx, but it was just a different city. And many people were recipients of Section 8. I had grown up in Section 8 housing. And there was something completely familiar about the people that I was interviewing. And rather than question what they were saying, I just trusted them. I believed them and I documented what I was seeing. And it was such an important part, like to me, that validation of like, well, and it just, and now I think, wow, like how amazing that like I had that privilege of sitting in people's living rooms and connecting with them and writing up then what I was noticing in the field, but that was not really well considered in the academic literature. And that really was the beginning of what I think it would eventually become a bigger field. And I was kind of a lone soldier in some ways at that point, but I didn't have a problem being a little different and taking a risk. I wonder right now, my advisor, I haven't reached out to him. He's at Harvard now. I really want to like just ask him like, what does he think about all of this stuff anyway, but I have to like go take him out to lunch. Okay, so the field, sorry, that's the origin story, right? So the field, I mean, I feel like it's evolved and blossomed and flourished and like there are just like so many beautiful, wonderful people that are like the new generation. And I see many of you here in the room. I'm just so proud of, you know, people really taking this on and like finding new directions and finding inspiration and like a, you know, like a line of inquiry and effort and advocacy and work. And like, I think this is, to me, it's partly about, you know, what that means for opportunity structures, right, for our students. But I think ultimately my hope and my biggest wish is that it really is transformative for people's lives. That as we're looking for new avenues for rate redesign and for energy efficiency and new technologies and all of that to unfold, that it literally materializes in people's lives, ultimately changing so that they can become their truest, most authentic, and most powerful selves.
That's yeah, clap for that. That is, you know, something you mentioned that I think for anybody who does qualitative research is so important, right? Like the privilege we have to sit with folks and they share their stories and share what we consider data that we can elevate their issues in ways. And the story about Edith realizing that she's not alone, right? You know, that's the opportunity we have as researchers to hear these individual stories and to quilt them together to raise an issue, again, up to the highest levels of policy and action. I want you to talk a little bit about, and tell me if this is okay, the emotional labor to do this type of work, right? I think what I want folks to take away from this is that, you know, we're really trying to solve something that you mentioned is inhumane, right? And so to sit in people's houses and have them tell you these stories, and as a researcher, you're not able to help in that moment, right? So you sometimes have to suppress, you know, the visceral reaction you might have to some of these stories, to the quality of some of the houses that you're in, to be able to do the work and do the analysis. And I just want people to understand from your perspective, 100+ interviews just for the book, but more over time, just what, you know, what it takes to do this work to get to this point.
It's such a good question. I have to say that ever since I was very young, I've been a highly sensitive person. And I read an academic book about highly sensitive people, and it gave me language to like understand like who I am. And I mean, if you speak to me long enough, I'll cry. No, that almost definitely, like, it could even happen today. But there's a way in which I just am a feeler. And so, to me, you know, connecting with people, again, as an empath and as someone who really loves people, it has been really emotional. And I carry the responsibility, the sense of obligation, to not just have the stories, listen to them, and do what I can, like help Miss Betty actually complete her story, like her letter, like those are the real like active moments. But to sit with that story and to really process it and like pay attention and go deeper and look and do, it's a lot, and it's a lot for someone who is very emotional. But I actually think that that's also like, I've had people tell me that they've read the book and had to put it down for a second. Because it's just, and it's like, but if we're not feeling that, then we're actually not understanding the problems that we're trying to solve, right? If it's just a bunch of regressions and we're only seeing like the typical usual suspects of inequality showing up in ways that are just about, some literally dot on a graph that whatever, it's like you can't really understand why it matters. And if we're not connecting to the why, then we're also not really, we're not actually like doing enough to really move the dial. And so my goal is, as someone who just, that, I don't know, it is a blessing, and it's also sometimes challenging, to be honest, to be a feeler in the ways that I'm a feeler. But I hope that it's inspiring, and that it inspires, again, like the necessary actions for what comes.
Well, I'm really glad that you're a feeler because I think that is what has allowed the work to be pushed forward, right? Is that you are going deeper because you really want to understand this from not only a sociological perspective, but also the very personal reactions that people are having to this issue of energy insecurity. So thank you for feeling and sharing people's story in a way that can bring action. Now, I've joked with you for some time about not being on social media, but you are doing a better job now. But I think, you talked about connecting with people, and I think this opportunity to communicate issues of energy insecurity is really important and is a way to connect folks with this work. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about your team and their social media presence, the hotandcold_NYC on Instagram. And when I visited you last year in New York, you had an energy insecurity experience that people could walk through. So I think, again, two amazing ways to connect people who may not understand this topic with what is really happening. So can you talk a little bit about that type of outreach and particularly the experience that you created?
Yeah, thank you for that. And our hot and cold here is so feel free to follow us. And it's all student run. We kind of worked on a project that was about documenting energy insecurity more locally in New York City. And, I just felt like I didn't want to keep doing the do. Like, yes, I'm an academic. I've been pretty successful in my career. I have nothing to prove at this point, in the sense that, like, if this is not actually driving impact, or at least driving more awareness for other people to, like, take it on, then it's probably not doing enough. And, you could have highly cited papers, but to be a famous academic is like, two people know you well. Like, you know what I'm saying? It's really, like, in the broad scheme of things, it's not that important. And so we just thought it was really important to start doing more to open up the conversation and the dialogue where people are, which is on social media. And so Hot and Cold is really about, we have media clearance. So we do interviews, we do surveys, but we also have media clearances that was vetted by the IRB and, like, the General Counsel's office, so that people can actually tell their stories for themselves. And we just kind of curate and edit those stories, and they're available. And I think it's really powerful and important. There was another part of the EOL. So the Energy Opportunity Lab that I co-direct, which is part of the Center on Global Energy Policy. Climate Week was happening. This is last year, and Climate Week happens year in and year out. It's become like a party in New York City, where, like, high-level people that are also going to COP and also, like, already meeting at Davos and the Aspen Institute and all that stuff are just basically they're doing the circuit. But I'm like, right in the backyard, uptown in Upper Manhattan and in the Bronx, there are people that are really dealing with climate impacts today, and they're not part of these conversations. They don't even know that half the stuff is happening. So we did this like event where we also kind of curated an experience where people would go in and kind of understand, like we had a room that was about difficulty paying, one that was about disconnections, being too hot, too cold, and the uptake of renewable energy, so solar and electric or induction stoves. And it was all based on data that we had collected locally, but it was a way for people, again, to like start to viscerally experience this. So I opened up this talk about going to the Arctic. I'm a sociologist, brown girl, like, you know, why do I need to go to the Arctic? And yet that experience was completely transformative for me because I felt stuff, because I saw things, and because it was such an important way for me to start to connect to like, how are people talking about climate solutions and where do I sit? Where do I fit into this conversation? And I think sometimes feeling things, seeing things, experiencing things is so critical for motivating, you know, like action. And you know, the truth is, I was talking to the students, to a group of students earlier, and we're talking about AI, and AI is really important. But you know, like the literacy rates in our country are declining. People aren't engaging with text. They're not necessarily always reading the books, especially not ones that might be perceived as inaccessible because they're academics. And so, or, you know, it's kind of academic text. And so, like, what are the ways in which we can bridge? And I think it's our responsibility as academics to find that pathway. Yes, we want to speak to our colleagues, but I think we also need to be kind of publicly engaged. At least I want to be.
Yeah, that's walking through that experience.
Here you go, Tony. Here you go. Is it okay?
All right. Walking through that experience, the rooms were different colors, right? So when you went into the hot room, it was red. The cold room was blue. I think the renewable energy room was yellow. And so, again, you could feel and hear the stories of people. And I love that you had people interview or talk to interviewers when they came out of the room, because you could capture their like immediate experience, their immediate thoughts coming out of that. And so I'll probably steal that idea and do it because it was so great.
We had coins too. I think we had
yes.
like 5 different basic, you know, expenses, and they only had 3 coins, so they had to make that like trade-off. So yeah.
Yeah. So, and again, like you say, experiencing these things allow you to understand how you can solve these problems. I want to talk a little bit about action. So you ended your presentation with an action framework. We understand the challenges that we have at the federal level. One, there's not enough federal funding to address this issue, but there's some amazing local action that is happening across the country. And so, you know, instead of feeling dismal about the whole LIHEAP team being fired at the federal level, potential reduction in funding or pause of funding, can you talk a little bit about local action? Because I think, you know, when I think about your earlier work on policies like stopping smoking in public housing and the positive health impacts that had, a lot of that stuff is, you know, comes from local action. So could you talk a little bit about local action? Because I think people in the room also are always saying, like, what can I do locally? So can you talk a little bit about local action?
Yeah. So so the context of, like, let's say energy assistance in this country is that the federal government has been the main source of support. Very few states, this year maybe there are 10, but in the past it was basically a handful of states that were supplementing energy assistance at all. And so there's really this kind of the eligibility enrollment gap is partly about resources that are inadequate, but also the fact that, like, it's not comprehensive enough. There haven't been enough, like, state and local initiatives to supplement. And so right now we're actually, we have this initiative called Cure EI. It's cities uniting to reduce energy insecurity. It's funded by the Sloan Foundation, and it's a small network of cities, New York City, Denver, and Atlanta. And what we've been doing is documenting their programs. Like, what programs do you have available, but what programs can be either, can we share ideas across the cities around different initiatives that kind of take this on more comprehensively? And what are the ways in which we can kind of learn and create even deeper networks of exchange and knowledge and practice? And what was very interesting, what has been interesting in doing that work, is knowing that the cities are basically saying we have enough goals. Where we need more support is actually in the implementation, in the operationalization of this, and in measuring impact, right? Because that's where the data piece is so critical, right? You can introduce a bunch of, like in New York City, you have Local Law 97, which is like creating pathways for big buildings to reduce their carbon emissions. That's all really important, but if we're not doing enough to track and also to identify buildings that need more support, it's, from an energy insecurity perspective, it's actually the 1 to 4 family buildings that are most heavily impacted, most at risk. All of the policies are actually about large buildings where you have investor owners. It's a very different kind of group of people. So we've been trying to refine and target at the city level using data, and then also thinking about the cross-learning opportunities across sites and trying to establish and develop different communities of practice around these issues.
Yeah, it's all about the data. I think that is a really good point, because the data you don't have is the problem you don't see, right? And so, highlighting data, using it to solve real problems is so necessary. So now we started this with, mentioning that, and we're going to open it up to questions from the audience here, but, the past 10 years and how this idea of energy insecurity has grown and increased in salience. And you showed the picture of the image of what Edith's home could be. So when you look at the next 10 years, how do we move from powerless to empowered? Like we put a lot of onus on the individual, and so I'm not saying that individuals need to solve their own energy insecurity, but how do we begin to empower people to look at this larger issue in a way where we push the folks that are the kind of purveyors of energy insecurity to take us to another level? So how do we move from powerless to empowered?
Good question. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is the role of utilities. Utilities are a big player in all of this, and the regulatory bodies that oversee 72% of the U.S. population is covered by an investor-owned utility, and the regulatory bodies are at the state level, and there's really, former Secretary Granholm was talking about the data center regulatory piece, but I think in general the affordability piece and these kind of legal standards around just, reasonable, and non-discriminatory pricing, where residential prices are really the root of the profit generation in the utility space is really critical. So the accountability piece there is important. Now, I also want to talk about, the impact of climate policy, right? If people are not feeling the impact, as in like it's actually materially changing their lives and their well-being, it's really hard for them to actually stay on board, get on board, like all the things. And where people live, it is just so well, first of all, that they have a home. So we have such a huge housing crisis in the US and that we have to solve. But a big part of that is actually keeping the homes that are existing online. And a big way that that happens is actually by improving their functionality, right? That we're addressing those inefficiencies and deficiencies and materially changing someone's life. Like, I don't know where Edith landed in life, and that makes me very frustrated and sad that I can't fully tell the end of that story. But no matter what, definitely she's not in that house, and that home, which would have been the source of family wealth, et cetera, is lost, right? For that, that was an investor that was putting up that Zillow thing, no doubt, right? Probably foreclosed and all the property tax foreclosure stuff that my friend Bernadette Twahane does. So I think that again, to close the loop on this question, they get super critical, and I think that's what made me most hopeful about the IRA, was the idea that there was the pre-weatherization dollars, the weatherization stuff, all of the opportunities for solar and storage. And so now I think it really will fall on local governments to start targeting areas, again, using a more kind of data-driven approach to knock door to door and to ease those burdens, the administrative burdens that make it very difficult for people to trust, but also figuring out pathways to make these things inexpensive. And the data center piece of this may actually be a part of the solution. So Google, for instance, in one site, started to invest, or at least that's kind of the proposal, is to invest in energy efficiency for local homes to reduce demand, but also for people to actually have a real material change in their homes. So I feel like those are the opportunities that we have to be, trying to be creative about. How do we resource this in light of, the shift in federal policy that would actually allow for people to still benefit?
Yeah, thank you, so much for the, kind of pushing us to think about how, again, we take the onus off the individual and actually make the structural changes to address this issue. What I love about your work is the focus on home, like home as the center of this research. A healthy home, it should be a place where people feel comfortable. It shouldn't be too hot, it shouldn't be too cold, and people should be safe, right? They shouldn't worry about their neighbor being energy insecure and setting the entire building on fire. And so this idea of safety, comfort, and health centered on home is so critical to your work and our understanding of this issue. I'm, again, honored to have had this opportunity to sit with you. I'm excited to open it up to the audience to hear their burning questions and your expertise in this area. So let's give Dr. Hernandez another round of applause. Question, please raise your hand. Question for Dr. Hernandez.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Tony. Daniel Ramey from Michigan and RFF. I'm just wondering about the federal policy angle here. Is there a window of opportunity coming in the next year or two where power prices are going to go up? The administration does not want to get saddled with that. Is anyone talking to you about this? Are you in touch with anyone in the government? Is there maybe appetite to put this issue back kind of on the front burner with what we are all expecting to see, which is higher electricity prices?
Yeah, I think you were asking the original question was about kind of the 10-year span. And what I actually see is there's a focus on energy affordability. People are really talking about energy affordability. I think it used to be the case that middle-income families could blow off a utility bill, but no longer. And I think once it starts to impact, middle and higher income households in ways there are people that are running full agendas, like political agendas around energy affordability. So definitely, I think that that's the conversation. But I think it still kind of comes down, not necessarily, because these are not like federally, so FERC has limited capacity in terms of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has limited capacity in terms of like full-on national oversight. So it still kind of comes down to the state regulatory bodies, the PUCs, the Public Utility Commissions, Public Service Commissions, to really focus on questions of affordability. And it usually is on a rate case by rate case basis. Right, so you have a utility that goes forward every 1 to 3 years, more or less, to ask for a rate increase. So I think that, and now they're projecting loads, which may, it's hard to estimate whether or not those the modeling is actually accurate. And so it is really kind of up to them to decide how this will move forward. And I am hopeful about that. I think I have trouble trusting the federal government right now with a lot of this. Anyway, and we'll leave it at that. I'm a little more hopeful, and and the places where you have more affordability right now are not the states. I think it's actually like the Californias, the New Yorks, a lot of the blue states where they have some of the highest rates because they might be more ambitious in terms of their climate policies. But they've been prioritizing the climate goals almost at the expense of everyday affordability. And I think that tension, we're starting to really see it play out. And I'm a little bit more hopeful that those states might get it right.
No, you're good. Go.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing all this. I think the stories and statistics are just so valuable, especially working for a nonprofit, working in clean energy, accessibility, and affordability. And sort of touching on the last thing you were talking about with the investor-owned utilities, we do kind of work on rate cases, and just seeing these constant increases in rates with some barriers, I'll say, for their, just focus on profit even when people are really suffering, as you've shown. Can't help but wonder if you think there's like a viable alternative model for utilities to operate in, if it's public power or municipalization. I was curious if that is something your book talks about at all. I haven't read it yet. I'd just love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, no, it's such a good question. I mean, I think we have to shift the model around, well, let me just say that the way that utilities are regulated is that they basically have the right to a profit. But we have not established a right to energy service provision, right, on the household end. And so I think we have to really re-articulate and reimagine the idea of rights. So do utilities have the right to make a profit, or do the people, this is kind of public good, have the right to benefit from that service and have it accessible and not be disconnected because of unpayable utility bills? So that's a big part of the framing piece of this that's necessary. And I think the way that kind of shifts is that we start to incentivize or change the model so that it's more based on savings, on cost savings, and on projections around projects that are really absolutely necessary. Monitoring, I know the Energy Equity Project is really thinking a lot about what goes into the rates as allowable kind of expenses, and to where they could have a rate of return on. So I think that there's like a big part of this, which is, and it's going up against the powerful utilities that are really profitable, and they're highly profitable right now. So I think that it's an uphill battle, but it's a necessary conversation. And then I think part of that then is also about the alternatives. So how do we then create a mix of public options, a lifeline tariff or rate where people have, as many kilowatts as they might need for, kind of the basics, and that anybody that uses in excess is paying more, like really just kind of moving the dial right now. I always like to say that someone who's earning $4 million a year pays the same rate per kilowatt hour as someone earning $40,000 per year. And that is very problematic from an affordability perspective and an equality perspective. So I think that there's a lot on the framing side, and I want to elevate Charles Hua's work, who's been doing a lot of work on, like the regulatory frameworks for utilities and what's necessary to kind of shift that.
Hello, thank you, Diana, for your amazing talk and your amazing book. I just have a question, because I know there's a lot of students here. I know that many have gone to class, but I have a question on like the student impact. So how do you see students, undergraduate, graduate, postdoc, fitting into this energy and security agenda and looking more into how we can take action?
Yeah. Well, Kyla, I just also want to thank you. Kyla is a co-convener of a book club, and they're reading Powerless right now and having discussions on a monthly basis. And I want to thank you for that and for taking this work so seriously. I think you're really a good example of what comes next. People taking the ideas, and no one person can move an entire a field agenda, whatever. This is really about mobilizing folks and having people feel like they're connecting to this issue. But I was recently at Drexel in Philadelphia, and it was interesting because we had a little student discussion. And one of the students was like, I don't even know really how to read my utility bill. I wouldn't even know how to start to get involved. And I think at some real basic level, actually what we found in our research is that young people are experiencing, people that are early professionals, post-college, starting to pay their bills, they're actually kind of disproportionately impacted because they haven't reached and this, I'm talking about people that are coming of age and will eventually be, us in 20 years. But, struggling at that moment. And I think that there's a real critical window. Again, people that care about climate, that care about these affordability issues and are struggling themselves. I feel like all of those things are really important mobilizing forces. But I do think that we have to connect dots. And, I'm a sociologist caring a lot about people. I think you have environmental health people, the people that are doing sustainability and climate. And sometimes they're not all talking about the same things. And I feel like we really do need to unlock the more interdisciplinary, ways of learning and understanding things, more practice-oriented, more project-based, more in the field, so that students start to see, experience, and see the pathways to jobs for themselves and for opportunities, because I think that that's important, and it's important for the people that are directly impacted by energy insecurity, but I think it's also important for the workforce that ends up supporting that cause in a serious way.
That's such a good point. I think something that's come up in my energy justice class for students is, the majority of them are renters, right? And around major campuses, landlords know they have a soft market, so they are limited or are not forced to make buildings as efficient as possible because they don't pay the utility bills. And so a lot of students have been sharing issues with their buildings as far as comfort, not being able to participate in energy efficiency programs, not understanding things that are on their utility bills. That's one of our first assignments, is that everybody brings in a utility bill. And so the energy and security experience of college students, I think, is another understudied topic in this area. You had a question, Maya? Yep. So one last question based on our time, but yeah.
Hi. Thank you so much for this talk. This was really, really interesting, and I definitely learned a lot. I was wondering, you were talking about the need for updated data as a driver of lack of research into energy insecurity. And I know you mentioned like new data is hard to come by, it's expensive, like people need to go out and gather it. So I was just wondering if there's any variables being collected like in census tracts and other surveys that are already happening that you've identified that can be used to build a quantitative case for energy justice. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really amazing question. So the American Community Survey, the census, does stuff around energy burden. And that's actually why it's gotten a lot of attention. It's very possible to get that data. We were probably some of the first researchers to like write about this several years ago. And the American Housing Survey also has some variables. The Residential Energy Consumption Survey is most comprehensive, but it is deployed every 4 to 5 years. And by the time it's made publicly available, and with everything happening now, it's not even really clear where the data transparency parts are. So what I've done and tried to like do a proof of concept for, and I think actually has been good, is working with the local Department of Health. So the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene has been an incredible partner. They deploy community health needs surveys every year. Every 1 to 3 years, I guess, depending, but they have like these special surveys too. So I think linking to these local organizations and agencies that have capacity for representative sampling is a way to like incorporate. They might be limited in terms of what they have, but at least you can start to make the links to health, which also is a kind of a motivator. It starts to be less about these experiences of hardship and more about also the adverse consequences that are related to health. So great question, thank you.
Right, let's give the mother of energy and security research another round of applause. And I see Vice Provost Baker wants to give us some parting words.
Another round of applause. I just like, So we are about to move into the book signing portion. I know many of you have her book. I think Tony made this point, but it cannot be overstated the impact your work has had on this field of energy justice, of policymaking. I mean, we are in the presence of such greatness, and your work is so incredibly impressive and so incredibly important to what we're all kind of working toward. And so I just want to thank you, Dr. Hernandez, personally, for being on the stage, and then having both of you, I'm starstruck, and I know both of you, and I'm like, this is just such a dream team to be in this conversation and to inspire our community. So thank you both for being here, and Diana, thank you so much for changing the world with your research. So welcome to the University of Michigan. We hope to see you again. And Tony, thank you as well for moderating this important discussion. Thank you.